You've been told a lie about California, the gold rush, the promise of wealth, the stories of brave pioneers building a better life in the Golden State. You've heard it all before. The American dream wrapped in sunshine and endless possibility. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Early California wasn't built by dreamers who found opportunity. It was built by people who suffered, who bled, who died by the thousands in conditions so brutal that most of them regretted ever coming here. The opportunity was a lie sold to desperate people. What they found instead was backbreaking labor that destroyed their bodies, wages that couldn't sustain life, disease that killed without mercy, and violence that was as routine as sunrise. The real builders of California weren't successful miners or visionary entrepreneurs. They were the broken bodies buried in unmarked graves. They were the workers who gave everything and received nothing. They were the ones whose pain built every road, every building, every foundation of what California would become. This isn't a story about manifest destiny or pioneering spirit. This is a story about exploitation. About how a state was constructed on the literal backs of people who were used up and thrown away. About how suffering, not opportunity, was the actual building material of early California. By the end of this documentary, you'll understand that the California dream was purchased with other people's nightmares. You'll see exactly how pain, not promise, created everything. And you'll realize that the people who actually built California rarely lived long enough to see what their suffering created. The history books lied to you. Let me show you what really happened. Let me show you the pain that built California. Let's set the scene properly. We're talking about California from 1848 to roughly 1870, the gold rush era and its immediate aftermath. This is when California transformed from a sparsely populated Mexican territory to an American state, and that transformation was built on human suffering on a scale that's hard to comprehend. When gold was discovered at Sutter's mill in 1848, word spread like wildfire. Within 2 years, over 300,000 people had flooded into California from around the world. They came from the eastern United States, from Mexico, from Chile and Peru, from China, from Europe. They came because they'd been sold a story, that California was opportunity incarnate, that anyone could strike it rich, that a better life was waiting. That story was a lie designed to lure labor. What these people actually found was a brutal, undeveloped territory with no infrastructure, no support systems, and no mercy for those who couldn't keep up. California in 1850 wasn't a land of opportunity. It was a meat grinder that consumed human lives to produce wealth for a tiny few. The geography itself was hostile. The Sierra Nevada mountains where most gold was found were harsh and unforgiving. Winters brought snow measured in feet and temperatures well below zero. Summers in the valleys brought heat that regularly exceeded 110 degrees. The land between settlements was dangerous, steep terrain, wild animals, no reliable water sources, and bandits who preyed on travelers. There was no infrastructure because there was no time or money spent building it. No real roads, just dirt paths that became impassable mud in winter and choking dust in summer. No bridges, so river crossings meant risking drowning. No supply chains, so shortages were constant and prices were astronomical. The settlements that formed were barely functional. San Francisco, which would become California's most important city, was a chaotic mess of tents and hastily constructed wooden buildings in 1849. The streets were mud mixed with garbage and human waste. Buildings burned down repeatedly because everything was wood and everyone used open flames. The city burned completely 6 times between 1849 and 1851. Mining camps were even worse. Temporary clusters of tents and lean-tos built wherever someone thought they might find gold. No planning, no sanitation, no law, just desperate people competing for resources in conditions that were designed to break them. This was the world people entered when they came to California. Not opportunity, not promise, just brutal conditions and the choice between suffering through them or dying quickly. And the entire economic system was structured to extract maximum labor from these people while giving them minimum reward. The mine owners, the merchants, the land speculators, they got rich. The people doing the actual work, they got broken bodies, empty pockets, and early graves. California wasn't being built by people pursuing dreams. It was being built by people whose labor was being stolen, whose bodies were being destroyed, whose lives were being sacrificed to create wealth they'd never see. The pain wasn't a side effect of development. It was the strategy. Work people until they broke. Pay them barely enough to survive. Replace them when they died or became too injured to continue. Repeat with the next wave of desperate people who'd been sold the same lies. This was early California, not golden, not full of opportunity, just a brutal extraction economy that ground human beings into dust and called it progress. And every building, every road, every piece of infrastructure that emerged from this era was built with pain. Literal, physical pain from the bodies of people who suffered to create it. Let me tell you what daily life actually looked like for the people whose pain built California. Not the sanitized version. The real version that breaks your heart and makes you grateful you weren't born then. Your home wasn't a home. If you were a miner, and most people were, you lived in a tent or a ramshackle lean, to made from whatever materials you could scavenge. Canvas that leaked. Wood that rotted. No insulation from heat or cold. No floor except dirt that turned to mud when it rained. You shared this space with strangers because you couldn't afford even this pathetic shelter on your own. Privacy didn't exist. You slept inches from other men, listening to them cough through the night. That wet, rattling cough that meant tuberculosis. You knew you'd probably catch it. Everyone did eventually. The cold in winter was brutal. You'd wake up with frost on your blanket if you had a blanket, your breath visible in the air inside your tent. No heat source except maybe a small fire that filled your shelter with smoke and barely took the edge off the cold. People froze to death in their sleep regularly. You'd wake up and the person next to you would be dead, frozen solid. You'd drag the body outside and try to get a few more hours of sleep. Summer was the opposite torture. Temperatures inside tents reached 120 degrees. No ventilation. No escape. You'd lie there sweating, dehydrated, dizzy from heat, trying to sleep before you had to work another 16-hour shift. Heat stroke killed constantly. You'd find men collapsed in their tents, dead from their brains literally cooking. Hygiene was impossible, and this impossibility created its own suffering. There was no soap because soap cost money you didn't have. There were no bathing facilities. The rivers you might wash in were the same rivers being used for mining, contaminated with mercury, human waste, and rotting animal carcasses. You wore the same clothes every day until they rotted off your body, weeks without changing, months without washing. Your clothes became stiff with dried sweat and dirt. The stench was overwhelming, but you became numb to it because everyone smelled the same. Your body was infested with lice and fleas. They lived in your hair, your clothes, your bedding. You itched constantly, scratched until you bled. The bites became infected. The infection spread. People died from infected flea bites because there was no treatment. Food was the daily obsession and daily suffering. If you were working as a laborer, you earned maybe $2 to $4 per day. Sounds okay until you realize that a single egg cost $1. A pound of flour cost $2. A meal at a tent restaurant, beans and hardtack, cost $1.50. You were spending your entire wage just trying to eat barely enough to keep working. The food itself was terrible. Hardtack was a cracker so hard it could break your teeth. You'd soak it in water or coffee to make it soft enough to chew. Salt pork was preserved meat so loaded with salt it burned your mouth and made you desperately thirsty. Beans were cooked over open fires, often undercooked or burned. Fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, forget it. Those were luxuries for the wealthy. Poor workers developing scurvy was universal. Your gums would bleed. Your teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. You'd develop sores that wouldn't heal. And you'd keep working because stopping meant not eating at all. The suffering of daily life wasn't dramatic. It was grinding. It was waking up in pain, working in pain, going to sleep in pain, and knowing tomorrow would be exactly the same. Your body was breaking down. You were malnourished. You were sick. You were exhausted beyond anything you'd ever experienced. And there was no end in sight, no days off, no vacation, no retirement. You just worked until your body gave out completely, and then you were replaced by the next person who'd been sold the lie about California opportunity. The pain of daily survival wasn't an unfortunate side effect of building California. It was the foundation. Every person suffering in a cold tent, going hungry, working sick, they were the building blocks. Their pain was the mortar, and California rose on their broken bodies while they received nothing but more suffering. Let's talk about the work that actually built California, not the romanticized version of rugged individuals striking it rich. The real version where people's bodies were used as tools and discarded when they broke. Mining was the primary industry, and it was designed to extract maximum value from human bodies. You worked 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 or 7 days per week. The work destroyed you systematically. You stood in freezing water for hours at a time. The water was glacial runoff, barely above freezing even in summer. You'd lose feeling in your feet within minutes. By the end of a shift, you couldn't tell if your legs were still there. Many miners developed permanent nerve damage. Their feet and hands never worked properly again. You were bent at the waist constantly, moving rocks, sifting gravel, panning for gold. This position destroyed your back. By age 30, men were stooped like 70-year-olds, their spines compressed, their muscles torn, constant screaming pain that never went away. Your hands bled from handling sharp rocks all day. The cuts would become infected. You'd develop abscesses. Your fingernails would crack and fall off. Your joints would swell with arthritis. And you'd keep working because the alternative was starvation. The water you stood in was toxic. Mercury was used extensively in gold processing, and it contaminated every waterway. You absorbed mercury through your skin every day. Mercury poisoning caused tremors, mental confusion, personality changes, and eventually insanity and death. They called it Mad Hatter disease, and it was epidemic among miners. And for this work, this body-destroying, soul-crushing labor, you earned barely enough to survive. The wages sound decent, $3 to $4 per day in the early years, but remember those prices. You were spending $2 to $3 per day just on food. Another $1 per day on your share of tent rent. Tools cost money. Clothing cost money. If you got sick or injured, you lost wages and went into debt. Most miners were in debt constantly. They borrowed money to eat, borrowed money to pay for shelter, borrowed money to replace tools. The interest rates were usurious, often 10% per month. Your debt grew faster than you could earn. You were trapped, working to pay off loans you could never repay until you died or became too broken to work. Chinese workers had it even worse. They were paid half what white workers earned for identical labor. They did the same backbreaking work, suffered the same injuries, died the same painful deaths, but earned $1 to $2 per day. They were charged the same prices for everything. They couldn't survive on those wages. They starved while working full-time. The pain of this wasn't just physical. It was the realization that you'd been lied to, that the opportunity was exploitation. That you traveled thousands of miles, left your family, invested everything for this. To be worked like an animal and paid barely enough to die slowly instead of quickly. Women who worked faced even more direct exploitation. Domestic work meant 18-hour days washing clothes by hand in water that destroyed your skin, cooking over fires that burned you, cleaning without proper tools or supplies. You earned maybe $20 per month. That's 67 cents per day for 18 hours of labor. Many women turned to prostitution because it was the only way to earn enough to survive. But prostitution in early California was its own hell. Brothel owners took most of your earnings. You saw multiple clients per day. Disease was universal, syphilis and gonorrhea that would eventually kill you in horrible ways. Violence from clients was constant. Most prostitutes were dead before 30, their bodies and minds destroyed by the work. Children worked too. Boys as young as 7 worked in mines, doing jobs adults couldn't, crawling into narrow spaces, handling explosives, sorting ore with their small hands. They were paid almost nothing. Their childhoods were stolen. Their bodies were broken before they finished growing. The work that built California, the actual physical labor that constructed roads, buildings, infrastructure, was done by people whose bodies were being sacrificed. Every shovelful of dirt moved, every nail hammered, every board cut. It was done by people in pain, working beyond exhaustion, knowing they were destroying themselves for wages that would never improve their lives. This wasn't opportunity. This was systematic exploitation. California wasn't built by people chasing dreams. It was built by people whose labor was being stolen, whose bodies were being consumed as resources, whose pain was the actual material used in construction. And the people profiting, the mine owners, the merchants, the land speculators, they got rich beyond measure while the workers building everything died poor. That's what building California actually meant. Not opportunity for the builders, just pain. Endless, grinding, soul-destroying pain. The pain that built California included the pain of dying slowly from diseases that could have been prevented, and the pain of injuries that turned workers into cripples or corpses. Death wasn't an occasional tragedy. It was the inevitable outcome of a system designed to use people up. Cholera killed thousands in waves of epidemics that swept through California repeatedly in the 1850s. The disease came from contaminated water, and all water was contaminated. Rivers were used simultaneously for drinking, bathing, mining, and sewage disposal. When cholera hit, people died within hours. You'd feel fine at breakfast and be dead by dinner, your body so dehydrated you looked mummified. The pain of cholera was intense, stomach cramps so severe people screamed. Vomiting and diarrhea so violent it left you empty and hollow. Then shock as your body shut down. And there was no treatment. You either survived or you didn't. When epidemics hit mining camps, 20% to 30% of the population would die in a week. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. Typhoid fever burned through you slowly. Weeks of fever so high you hallucinated, unable to keep food down, wasting away until you were skeletal. The pain was the endless burning inside, the weakness so profound you couldn't lift your head, and knowing you were probably going to die. Dysentery was so common it was called the California quick-step. Bloody diarrhea from bacteria in filthy water. It killed through dehydration and weakness. The pain was constant cramping, the indignity of losing control of your body, and the exhaustion of being unable to absorb nutrients even when you ate. Tuberculosis spread in the crowded, filthy conditions where workers lived. You'd cough blood for months, each breath harder than the last. The pain was the suffocation, the knowledge that your lungs were failing, and the certainty that you'd die slowly while infecting everyone around you. Scurvy rotted you from the inside because fresh food was too expensive for workers. Your gums would bleed, your teeth would fall out, old wounds would reopen. You'd bruise from the lightest touch. The pain was the feeling of your body disintegrating while you were still alive. Injuries were just as deadly as disease and often more painful. Mining accidents were daily occurrences. Cave-ins buried workers alive. They'd suffocate slowly in the dark, crushed under rock and dirt. The ones who were dug out, if anyone bothered, were often so broken they died anyway. Explosives used in mining detonated prematurely constantly, blowing off hands, arms, faces. The pain of having your flesh torn from your bones, of looking at the bloody stumps where your hands used to be, of knowing you'd never work again and therefore couldn't survive. Without antibiotics or proper medical care, any injury could kill you through infection. A cut on your hand would become infected. The infection would spread, red streaks racing up your arm. Blood poisoning would set in. You'd develop fever, delirium, then death. The pain was watching your flesh rot while you were still alive, and knowing there was nothing anyone could do. Amputations were common solutions to severe injuries. They'd saw off your crushed or infected limb with no anesthesia while you screamed. If you survived the shock and pain, infection would probably kill you anyway. If you somehow survived that, you were now disabled in a world that had no use for disabled workers. You'd starve or freeze to death because you couldn't work. The pain of medical care was often worse than the injuries. Doctors were frequently frauds with no training. They'd prescribe mercury for everything, which poisoned you. They'd bleed you, which weakened you. They'd perform surgery in filthy conditions with unwashed hands and unsterilized tools, ensuring infection. Workers died constantly, not occasionally. Constantly. Every mining camp had graves that outnumbered the living population. Every town had cemeteries that were the largest structures around. People died from disease, from injury, from malnutrition, from exhaustion. They died young. Average age at death was probably mid-30s for workers. And their deaths built California as much as their labor did. Because when workers died, they were replaced. The system didn't pause, didn't mourn, just brought in new workers who would also be used up and discarded. The pain of dying in early California was knowing your death was meaningless to everyone except you, that you'd be buried in an unmarked grave and forgotten. That California would keep rising while you rotted beneath it. The suffering from disease and injury wasn't an unfortunate reality of frontier life. It was the cost that poor workers paid so wealthy men could get richer. Every preventable death, every untreated injury, every disease that spread through contaminated water, it was all acceptable to the people profiting from the system. California was built on pain. The pain of dying slowly from diseases caused by the conditions workers were forced to live in. The pain of injuries from dangerous work done with inadequate safety measures. The pain of knowing your body was being destroyed and there was nothing you could do about it. The pain that built California included the pain of constant fear, of violence that could come at any moment, of knowing that no one would protect you and no one would punish those who hurt you. Law enforcement barely existed in early California, and where it did exist, it protected property and the wealthy, not workers. If you were poor, if you were a laborer, if you were not white, you had no protection from anything. Murder was routine. In San Francisco alone, multiple people were killed every day in the early 1850s. Mining camps saw murders regularly. Men shot over claims, over gambling debts, over insults real or imagined. The pain wasn't just dying violently. It was living with the knowledge that you could be killed at any moment and no one would investigate, no one would care, no one would seek justice. Vigilante justice was the only justice, and it was brutal and arbitrary. Communities formed vigilance committees that would capture suspected criminals and hang them within hours. No trial, no evidence, no due process. The pain was knowing that you could be accused of something you didn't do and executed before sunset. That your life could end based on a mob suspicion. Chinese immigrants faced systematic violence that was designed to maintain their exploitation. White workers, angry about their own poverty, blamed Chinese workers for low wages instead of blaming the employers paying both groups poorly. Mobs would attack Chinese camps, beating and killing residents, burning their homes. The pain was living in constant fear, knowing violence could come at any time and the law would do nothing, would often participate. Native Americans faced genocidal violence. State-funded militias hunted them. Bounties were paid for scalps, men's, women's, children's. Villages were raided and burned. People were massacred. The pain was watching your community destroyed, your family killed, your culture erased, all with official government approval. Mexican residents who'd lived in California before U.S. annexation faced violence and theft. Their land was taken through fraud or force. Anglo-Americans would decide they wanted a Mexican's property and simply take it, knowing the legal system would support them. The pain was losing everything your family had built, being driven from your home at gunpoint, and having no recourse because the law didn't protect you. Workplace violence was routine. Bosses and foremen beat workers who complained or slowed down. The pain was being struck with tools, whipped, kicked, and knowing that if you fought back, you'd be fired or killed. That your body was property to be disciplined however management saw fit. Women faced sexual violence constantly. In a population that was 90% male in the early years, women were targeted relentlessly. Assault was common. Rape was common. The pain wasn't just the physical violation. It was knowing that reporting it would accomplish nothing, that you'd be blamed, that your attacker would face no consequences. Theft was constant because everyone was desperate. Your tools would be stolen. Your food would be stolen. Even your clothing would be stolen while you slept. The pain was losing things you needed to survive and having no way to replace them. Knowing that theft could mean death if you couldn't work without your tools. The violence that built California wasn't incidental. It was structural. It was how the system maintained control over exploited workers. Fear kept people in line. Violence crushed attempts at resistance. The pain of constant fear, of knowing you were unprotected, of experiencing violence with no justice, that pain was part of how California was built. Workers who tried to organize for better wages or conditions faced violence from employers and from the state. Strikes were broken by force. Union organizers were beaten or killed. The pain was knowing that trying to improve your situation could get you killed, but accepting your situation meant slow death through exploitation. The lawlessness of early California wasn't an absence of order. It was a specific kind of order designed to benefit the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. The pain of violence and fear was distributed deliberately, concentrated on the poor, on immigrants, on anyone who lacked power. Every building, every road, every piece of infrastructure in early California was constructed by people who lived in fear, who worked while looking over their shoulders, who knew violence could come for them at any moment. Their fear and pain were part of the construction process. The pain that built California was not distributed equally. Women, children, and immigrants suffered uniquely brutal exploitation that literally constructed the state while destroying them. Women's pain was immediate and specific. In a society that was overwhelmingly male, women were simultaneously valuable and completely vulnerable. If you were a woman in early California, your options were: be married and endure endless domestic labor in horrific conditions, work as a domestic servant for starvation wages, or become a prostitute and face almost certain early death. Married women labored ceaselessly. You cooked over open fires that burned your face and arms. You washed clothes by hand in water so cold it left your hands cracked and bleeding. You bore children in conditions that killed mothers and babies regularly. No medical care, just pain and hope. Your work built California by supporting the male workers, by raising the next generation of workers, by doing all the reproductive labor that made exploitation possible. The pain of being a woman in early California was knowing your work was essential but worthless in the eyes of society. You labored as hard as any miner but were paid nothing if you were married, almost nothing if you were a servant. Your body was destroyed by constant pregnancy, by brutal working conditions, by malnutrition. And no one counted your suffering as part of the cost of building California. Prostitutes, pain was even more direct and brutal. You sold your body because it was often the only way to earn enough to survive. Brothel owners took most of your money. You saw multiple clients per day, drunk men, violent men, men who saw you as an object to use. Disease was universal and untreatable. Syphilis would slowly drive you insane and kill you. Gonorrhea would leave you in constant pain. The pain wasn't just physical. It was the social death, the knowledge that you were considered the lowest of the low, that no one would help you or mourn you. Sex workers' labor built California too. They provided services that kept male workers in the region. They spent money in local economies. They endured suffering that was as real as any miner's. But they've been erased from the story because their pain was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. Children's pain built California in ways that are almost unbearable to contemplate. Child labor was universal. Boys as young as 7 worked in mines, risking death daily. They crawled into spaces too small for adults. They handled explosives. They operated machinery that crushed their small hands. The pain for children was the theft of childhood itself. No play, no education, no safety. Just work from the moment you could be useful until you were injured or killed. Your small body was used to extract gold, to build roads, to do agricultural labor. You were paid almost nothing. And when your body broke, when your spine curved from carrying heavy loads, when your lungs filled with dust, when your hands were mangled by machinery, you were discarded. Chinese immigrants suffered exploitation that was specifically designed to maximize their pain while minimizing their cost. You were paid half what white workers earned. You did the same work, often more dangerous work, but your suffering was considered less important because of your race. You built the western portion of the Transcontinental Railroad, arguably the most important infrastructure project in California's history. You set explosives while hanging from cliff faces. You tunneled through mountains. You died by the thousands from explosions, from avalanches, from accidents. Your pain built the railroad that connected California to the rest of America, and you were paid starvation wages and given the most dangerous jobs deliberately. The pain wasn't just the work. It was the systematic racism that justified your exploitation. You were blamed for low wages even though employers set the wages. You faced violence from white workers who should have been your allies against shared exploitation. You lived in segregated camps with the worst conditions. And when you died, often no one recorded it. Your suffering built California, and California pretended you didn't exist. Mexican workers and residents faced the pain of dispossession. If you'd been living in California before U.S. annexation, you watched your property rights ignored or stolen. Anglo-Americans took your land through legal manipulation or outright violence. You went from landowner to laborer overnight. The pain was losing everything your family had built over generations. Being driven from your home, being forced to work for poverty wages on land that used to be yours, watching a society you'd helped create treat you as an intruder. Your suffering built California by providing land and labor, but the story of California pretends you were never there. Indigenous people faced pain that can only be described as genocidal. Your population dropped from 150,000 to 30,000 in just 20 years. Disease killed many, but systematic violence killed more. State-funded militias hunted you. Your villages were destroyed. Your children were kidnapped and sold as laborers. Your culture was targeted for elimination. The pain was watching your world destroyed deliberately, seeing your family killed. Knowing that this violence had official approval, that the people doing it were proud of it. Your suffering didn't build California. It cleared the land so California could be built by others on top of your graves. The pain of women, children, and immigrants was essential to building California. Their exploitation was deliberate and systematic. Their suffering was the foundation, and their stories have been erased because acknowledging the pain would undermine the myth of opportunity. If you want to understand how California was truly built on pain, look at the winter of 1856-1857, a moment when all the accumulated suffering reached a breaking point and revealed the system for what it really was. This was 3 years into an economic depression that had devastated workers while leaving the wealthy largely untouched. Mines had stopped producing. Claims were abandoned. Tens of thousands of workers were suddenly unemployed with no savings, no safety net, and no way to leave California because they couldn't afford passage. In San Francisco, vigilante committees had taken complete control. They weren't protecting the community. They were protecting property and wealth through terror. They hanged people regularly, often on flimsy evidence or no evidence at all. The pain was living under mob rule, knowing that you could be accused and executed within hours. In the mining camps, the pain reached levels that are hard to describe. Winter came early and severe. Snow fell in the mountains while supplies ran out. The trails became impassable. Food prices in the camps skyrocketed because nothing could get in. A pound of flour that normally cost $2 suddenly cost $10, $15, $20. Workers who were already malnourished now faced starvation. Not hunger, starvation. They ate their leather belts and boots. They ate grass and bark. They fought over scraps that wouldn't sustain a dog, and they died. The pain of that winter was watching people you knew waste away, seeing men who'd worked beside you become skeletal, their eyes hollow, their bodies too weak to move, watching them die slowly while you wondered if you'd be next. Some camps were completely cut off, no supplies in or out for months. The suffering was unimaginable. People froze to death in their tents because they were too weak from hunger to gather firewood. They died of diseases their starved bodies couldn't fight off. They gave up and just lay down to die because continuing was too painful. When spring came and rescue parties reached these camps, they found graveyards. Camps of 200 people where 50 were still alive. Bodies everywhere, in tents, in the snow, along trails where people had tried to walk out and collapsed. The pain of that winter was the realization that no one was coming to help, that the people who'd gotten rich from your labor didn't care if you lived or died, that you were expendable, that California would keep rising even if you were buried beneath it. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was the inevitable result of a system built on exploitation. Workers had been paid barely enough to survive with no ability to save. When work disappeared, they had nothing. When supplies ran low, they couldn't afford what remained. The system created the conditions for mass suffering, and then let it happen because poor workers' pain didn't matter to the people in power. That winter revealed what building California actually meant. It meant human beings treated as disposable resources. It meant suffering on a massive scale accepted as normal. It meant that the pain of ordinary people was the price of progress, and that price was paid without hesitation. You need to understand how different your life is from theirs, how much of your comfort and safety was built on their pain. Today, when you work, there are labor laws protecting you. Minimum wage, maximum hours, overtime pay, safety regulations, workers' compensation if you're injured, the right to organize. All of these protections exist because people in the past suffered without them, and their pain eventually forced change. The people who built early California had none of this. They worked as long as employers demanded for whatever wage was offered. They had no recourse if they were cheated, injured, or killed. Their pain created the eventual demand for protections you now take for granted. Today, if you're sick or injured, you can access medical care that would seem miraculous to someone from 1850s California. Antibiotics cure infections that used to mean death or amputation. Surgery is safe and painless with anesthesia and sterilization. Diseases that killed thousands, cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, are preventable or treatable. The people who built California died from things you recover from easily. Their pain from untreated injuries, from diseases that ravaged their bodies, from medical procedures done without anesthesia. That suffering is alien to you because their deaths eventually drove medical advancement. Today, you have access to affordable, safe food and clean water. The pain of malnutrition, of scurvy, of waterborne diseases, these are distant history for you. But for the people building California, this suffering was daily reality. They starved while working full-time. They died from drinking contaminated water. Their pain was part of the process that eventually created public health systems you benefit from. Today, if you're victimized by crime or violence, there are systems meant to help you. Police, courts, victim services. These systems are imperfect, but they exist. The people who built California had nothing. Their pain from violence, from having no protection, from watching justice be a privilege of the wealthy, that suffering eventually created demands for systems that serve everyone. The California you see today, the prosperity, the technology, the opportunities, was built on foundations of pain. The roads were built by people whose backs broke. The buildings rose on land cleared by people who were driven off or killed. The wealth was extracted by people who died poor after lifetimes of labor. Your comfort was purchased with their agony. Your opportunities exist because they had none. Your safety was built on their suffering. This isn't about guilt. It's about understanding what building California actually meant and what it cost. Early California was built on pain, not opportunity. Pain. Every single piece of infrastructure, every building, every road, every system. It was constructed using human suffering as the primary material. The people who did the actual building worked until their bodies broke, were paid barely enough to die slowly instead of quickly, and were discarded when they could no longer produce value for others. This wasn't the unfortunate cost of progress. This was the strategy. Extract maximum labor from human beings while giving them minimum compensation. Work them until they broke. Replace them when they died. Repeat with the next wave of desperate people who'd been sold lies about opportunity. The pain wasn't incidental. It was structural. It was how the system functioned. And the people who profited from that pain became the celebrated pioneers and builders of California, while the people whose actual labor and suffering built everything were forgotten. When you think about early California, don't think about gold rushes and pioneers. Think about the workers who stood in freezing water until they couldn't feel their legs. Think about the children whose childhoods were stolen. Think about the women whose options were suffering or different suffering. Think about the immigrants who built everything and were treated as less than human. They built California with their pain, with their bodies, with their lives, and most of them got nothing in return except more suffering and early graves. This is the truth that was erased from history books. This is the reality behind the myth of opportunity. California wasn't built by dreams, it was built by pain. If this documentary opened your eyes to the real history that's been hidden, there are more stories like this on this channel. Every state has a history of suffering that's been sanitized and forgotten. Every piece of American development was built on someone's pain. Watch the other state documentaries. Learn the truth. Understand that the world you live in was built by people who suffered so you could have what you have. Honor their pain by remembering it. Honor their sacrifice by understanding what it actually cost. And be grateful, deeply, genuinely grateful, that you live now and not then. Because if you had to endure what they endured to build California, you wouldn't have survived. None of us would have. Their pain built everything. Remember that.